Ethar El-Katatney is here. She is an Egyptian journalist, she is a blogger, and she is an author. She was actively involved in the historic protest in Egypt last spring that overthrew the former president. I am pleased to have her here at this table for the first time. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happier to be here.
Why are you here in the United States?
This is my first time in America. I'm here on a fellowship with the World Press Institute based in Minnesota. So we're 10 journalists from 10 different countries around the world. We tour 10 states. We visit the biggest newsrooms, biggest organizations all around, and learn about U.S. journalism, politics. So we're halfway in now, and it's been very, very interesting.
Tell me what the moment is in Egypt.
Oh, Egypt. You know, today, or yesterday now, there were supposed to be, last week on Friday, there were huge protests. You know, they attacked the Israeli embassy, they destroyed an exterior wall, the Ministry of Interior, they set a fire. There was a protest outside the Egyptian Radio and Television Union. And the problem I see is that what that did is that the military has now decided to enforce emergency law. And you know, emergency law, we've been under that for maybe what, wasn't even born, like 40 years or something. And under emergency law, last year Mubarak actually reduced the emergency law to only concerning things of terror or drug trafficking and not actually apply any of the rest. But now what last week happened is that the military decided to enforce all of the emergency law, which actually is that's even worse. That was actually one of the primary demands of the revolution, was the removal of the emergency law.
I remember.
Removal is something, you know, if I'm under emergency law, if you're more than 5 people gathered, that's against the law. So if I'm sitting with my friends at Starbucks, you know, that's actually against the law. The police has the right to pick me up, keep me indefinitely, no trial, no charges, nothing. So
that was one of the rallying cries, as you say, the protests in the streets.
Exactly.
And they were hoping the army would do it day one.
Yep. And now we're right back to, you know, we're right back to where we started. Not obviously in terms of everything, but in terms of this, the idea that they're going to enforce it even more. So today, there was supposed to be protests that were actually against that, calling, you know, critiquing the army, how could you do that? But only 1,000, not even 1,000 people showed up, which I think shows you the apathy. You know, when you have so many cries, so many fragmented groups, there's no vision, there's no unity, there's no kind of what are we working towards, what do you want, you know, what is your plan? We've never had a protest culture, we've never had an idea of these are your demands and how you go about getting them, when do you be aggressive, when do you go back? So what this created is chaos and anarchy, and that's giving the military just cause to crack down even more. You have elections that have now been postponed. You know, they were supposed to be this month and then October, and now PA has been in November. You have Shura in January. And having the different elections at different times just increases the transitional period, which means it postpones how long it'll be before we even get a president. And the military's response to that is that the judiciary were the ones who demanded that they keep the elections separate. So you have all this, what we call, you know, tamtiya, which is basically keeping things going on for as long as possible, dragging them on. They drag out. And when they drag out, people get tired. You know, people want to go back to their day-to-day lives. You know, the people are exhausted. We're not, so much changed happened.
Which is an interesting point about this. I mean, the people who created this revolution were people who had regular jobs. They weren't people who had been involved in a movement. For the most part. They were people who had jobs as doctors and lawyers and nurses and teachers and a whole range of things, and journalists.
Everyone. And actually, that's what made it successful, I think. The idea that there was no leader, it was just one unified vision. You know, we want him to go. We want the regime to change. But now that they did that, now it's kind of like, okay, so now what? Now, even people who are demanding now we don't want Tabtawi, who's the head of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. If he leaves, then what? You know, there is no, as Egyptians, we have a very famous psychologist, Ahmed Ukesha, who has a book written. And in his book, you know, the premise is, the argument is that over the last 30 years, Egyptians have been reduced to children. You know, you feed them, you clothe them, but don't make them think. You know, we're not used to even.
A dependence culture.
It's a very much a dependence culture, and also a culture that lives very day-to-day existence. You know, you have 40% of the population who lives on less than $2 a day. That's less than the poverty line. They live day-to-day. They can only see day-to-day. I can't go tell them, you know, your lives are hard now, but in 10 years, you know, your children, they'll have a better political life. All they see is, all it boils down to is, our lives were hard before the revolution. They're harder now, and we live in all this risk and uncertainty, which means the revolution was bad.
There's a kind of context in Egypt in which they believe that they can't live with the army, they can't live without the army.
Yes, very much. You have all these jokes, you know, the army is like a wife whose husband is cheating on her. You know, she knows, but she can't do anything because she wants the kids to be safe. All these very Egyptian jokes. We have a very high sense of humor and melodrama that The army has existed for so long in our culture. You know, when the army walked into the square, we greeted them with like flowers. You know, people were like, here, take pictures with our babies. The joke, every single person changed their Facebook picture to a standing next to, you know, the tank. Because with war, you know, 73, 67, the armies always had a very kind of grandeur. They're very, very big in the eyes of Egyptians.
And it probably grew because they did not crack down.
Exactly. You can compare it with Syria now, or what's happening is that the army stood by the Egyptian people. They chose us over them. But
so
even
its expectation of the army grew at that moment.
Definitely. There were so many expectations. And to be fair to the army, they could have been very, very negative. But at the same time, you have to realize sometimes there's a different agendas at play. There's so many different agendas, so many. And for the average, even something like the trial of Mubarak, you know, a lot of people, you have, of course, state TV spinning it as, look how transparent the military is, you know, they've done this. And a lot of people realize, but not so much, that this is actually a very smart move by the army. Not just they sold out Mubarak completely, but the idea that it does give them added, you know, credibility, transparency, much more. It reinstates goodwill, and it also helps ease this. Like 3 days before that, they cleared out the square from July 8th until, you know, for almost a couple of weeks. There were sit-ins in the square. I was at the square a day before they cleared it out, and when they cleared it out, the huge negative outpouring towards the army. How could they do that right before Ramadan started? And then a day later was the trial, and that kind of was like, shh, you know, look, people just suddenly forgot about what the army, how they cleared out the people who were already planning on leaving because of the holy month of Islam, Ramadan.
Just make sure I got the right temperature here. You have a growing pessimism?
I'm naturally pessimistic, but I can't be, you can't say that it will be until you actually see what happens. So even though, you know, a lot of expectations were that the elections would be postponed. But you had even more negative reactions, which is that they would be rigged somehow, or that we would end up with a parliament, whether it was skewed towards Muslim Brotherhood members, or however much the jigsaw in the end ends up, what parties take what. But until that actually happens, until we have something solid and concrete to be, oh, this is what happened, that means the military did this, we can't really judge. My biggest pessimism, or you can say negative expectation, is that people forget that Cairo is not Tahrir Square, right? That Egypt is not Tahrir Square.
Right.
You know, if you go out, I went out to Upper Egypt, to villages, to do reports. Outside of Cairo, so many people don't care. They don't care who is president, who is leader. They don't care about the army. They care about, we want to feed our kids, we want to send them to school, we want to be able to get married and get a job. I have my village leader, and that's who I look to. If you tell me about constitution or anything, I'll ask him. Whatever he tells me, that's what I go to do. And that's the majority of the population. You know, the day Ahmed Shafiq resigned, who was the prime minister. So we had Assam Sharaf go out to Tahrir, the new prime minister, and he was greeted, you know, with, everyone's so happy. So I covered that protest, and then I went out to Ahmed Shafiq's house, who's now the ex-prime minister, and there was a protest there of people who were like, no, you shouldn't have resigned, we love you. So I interviewed a woman, and I'm like, so why are you here? And why do you support him? She said, no, I don't support him. I hate that guy. I'm here to protest against the dictatorship of Tahrir, of the people who are speaking for us, and they are not. So my fear is that the people outside of Cairo who only who call now even the Tahrir, the people who did their whole revolution, you know, you're just this bunch of youth who are irrational and all you did is mess up our country. Now we're just in all this chaos and anarchy. Our lives aren't better, and now we don't like you. And now we will support the military because we don't like you, or we will support whatever happens. Even those who are pro-Mubarak, a lot of them, it's not because they are pro-Mubarak, they're pro-normalcy. They are pro a life that's just, let's just get our lives going again, because it's not. We've lost like billions of dollars, the economy, tourism, down the drain. So this is my fear, is that the average citizen comes to see that the revolution was bad, that just having it was a bad idea.
Is there a 50-50 chance that will happen?
At this point, you know, your guess is as good as mine. Things change so rapidly, you can't predict, you know, you really can't predict at all what could happen at this point.
Mubarak. The trial of Mubarak.
The trial of Mubarak. You know, I was watching that, you know, with my parents, and I remember my dad started crying, and I told him, so why are you crying? He's like, he's just such an old man, you know, it's just a difference between my generation and the elderly generation, you know, who grew up with Mubarak. I grew up with Mubarak, as you know, he did do so much for the country, you have to be realistic. But the idea of, you know, the elderly, we grow up in a culture that's very, you know, you look at your leaders as your grandparents, especially since most of them are really old, you know. Like, we've interviewed most of the candidates, they're old men. And so to respect for your elderly is a huge thing. You look at your leaders as people you respect, but not necessarily as people you appointed and hold accountable. So you know, that look, his sons are protecting him in the cage, you know, from the shame of being on TV. And so for a huge generation, there was a huge outpouring of sympathy for Mubarak, you know, much the same as his second speech when he talked about how, you know, I was born here, I will die on this soil. But the trial is interesting in the sense that a lot of people didn't think it would happen. And like I was telling you, that created a whole lot of goodwill towards the army. But also the idea that I don't think Mubarak would actually go. I think it'll drag on until he dies. I think his sons will probably get a couple or 3 or 4 years in jail, and then they'll make their way to whatever kind of country and run away and live the rest of their lives. But the holding leaders accountable is creating a huge kind of, you know, like, let out your breath. So Mubarak's trial, it's ongoing, it's been postponed. You have September 24th, him and his sons, Habib Adli, who is the Ministry of Interior. It will be interesting to see if they will call on Tantawi, who's the head of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, to bear witness, because, and they also called on the ex-vice president, Omar Suleiman. The judge has refused to have any more televised hearings, which created a huge negative sense among people. But it's also good because, like I was saying, it makes people focus on the real issues. You know, let's get back to help this country, you know, work again, rather than just focusing on, you know, the drama and the soap opera of the trial. But it will be interesting to see how it ends up. I don't think, you know, you had boxes and boxes of, you know, testimonials carried into the courtroom. You know, it's kind of hilarious. The last session, reporters from there, you know, that the lawyers started beating each other up when, like, someone held up a sign of Mubarak. It's very comical and very sad, and it gives you insight, obviously, into Egypt's legal system. I think there was one tweet I was reading, and it talked about how Mubarak's sons, this was probably the first time they'd ever had to see, you know, what kind of system the average Egyptian has to go through.
The accusations in this specific charge, as I understand it, is primarily that he ordered the military to kill protesters. Is there a sort of, among the people that you know, the journalists who have looked at this beyond just an average citizen, a sense that there is crucial evidence that will prove that?
I doubt there will be crucial evidence, simply because, you know, they had weeks and weeks before even the Ministry of Interior was stormed or anything to remove any kind of information that could have been even remotely, you know, that could prove that case. And I don't think the average citizen actually cares, like, obviously if they care because if they're families or, you know, the martyrs, but it's more of seeing him being punished. You know, vengeance, which I think, you know, that's what it's reduced to.
Everybody's accountable to the law.
Everything's accountable to the law, and for them to be ibra, what we say, you know, an example to anyone who comes after. And that's actually what a lot of people say about the military. You know, what if the military decides to stay in power forever? And the simplest argument to that is that if they do, the people will take to the streets again. You know, it's not as simple as before. It isn't like our previous leaders who knew that they could do whatever they want. It's not like any of the charges against anyone, any of the businessmen, anyone who's been sentenced, were ever a surprise. It wasn't a surprise that, you know, they were taking land for free, or that they were building things, or that they were overcharging, or monopolies. Everyone knew. It was just a system that never held them accountable, that they were above the law. But I think now, once the barrier of fear has been broken for the majority of Egyptians, that no longer do we have this fear of anyone's above the law. It's very much that no one's above the law, that we've reclaimed what it means to be, you know, a citizen, to have power, that you are empowered. And I think once Egyptians have felt that, there's no going back. There's no going back from the feeling it was in the square, that I have a role, that my voice is heard, that I'm contributing to my country. You know, we never had flags. You know, this is one of the things I've been surprised here, the amount of American flags everywhere, how we never had this. The only time we ever carried our flag was at football, you know, the African Cup of Nations, when we were cheering on our country to play football. But the idea that everyone was proud of their flags, they're proud to be Egyptian, to have a voice, and to make sure that even on their own individual scale, with their communities, that they will help make a change.
It is a delight to talk to you and to meet you.
Likewise,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
I hope we can do this again.
Inshallah, God will. Thank you very much for having me.